Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Good afternoon and welcome to the Global Energy Outlook Forum 2024. We are now in the European section of our day. We've been through Asia and the Middle East, over 20 sessions today with 50 commentators from around the world. Now in Europe, although Mike Muller is stretching time and geography. I think Mike is in Singapore, but still bringing a global perspective, which is very much the nature of this particular session. Oil markets remained relatively immune to 2023 black swans, is the title of our session. And what are your top 3 trends, events, black or gray, that will determine the direction of oil markets in 2024? That's kind of the subject parameter of what we're looking at here with our 2 stalwarts, Christoph Ruhl, Senior Research Scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University, and Mike Muller, Head of Asia at Vitol, who are always joining us through the year, usually a month in review, a month ahead. On this occasion, it's a year ahead. So Mike Muller, let's kick off with you. And perhaps with the year ahead, we take some context from the year behind, hence the title of this session. Why were oil markets, oil prices relatively immune, as they continue to be, to what in previous eras would have major geopolitical events, like in the Middle East in particular, turbulence even in the shipping lanes of the Red Sea, and yet oil markets, oil prices in 23 and continuing into 24 are relatively immune. Your thoughts on that thesis, if indeed you believe it, or 2, why does it exist?
So taking oil, the real black swan event, if you look at any price chart, was COVID, right? Standout in terms of price impact. If you take the wider energy markets and natural gas and power in particular, then of course the Russia-Ukraine crisis and other factors have caused turmoil there. But since your question was about oil, indeed, we've started the year in a $75, $79 per barrel type range for Brent. And the fundamental view remains one of a relatively balanced market. Whilst inventories are historically at the lower end of the range, very much a product of OPEC plus price policy, there is also a very balanced view in terms of how demand is ebbing. We still have year-on-year demand growth. So whilst in the Western Hemisphere, there's very much a mindset of peak oil demand being behind us, Asia is still racing ahead in terms of consumption and strata of population joining the consuming middle classes and all that. But yeah, the reason you're not seeing prices reflecting black swan events and all is these are not black swan events. They're very much newsworthy. They're very important, and some of them carry great dangers. But things like the joint military action to prevent missiles from Yemen hitting merchant fleet ships coming through the Bab el-Mandeb have not served to materially disrupt shipping routes and have not served to materially disrupt oil prices.
Christoph Ruhl, your thoughts on the same subject? I mean, I might take a little issue with Mike there. We don't need to literally shut down the world economy like COVID in order to sort of define a black swan event, at least not in my black swan definition book. Missiles shooting across the Red Sea, they get close to kind of black swanny, but nonetheless, in either case, definition aside, oil markets are relatively undisturbed by events in 23, and they continue to be in 24. Is that the case? Your thoughts?
Well, this is one of these rare occasions where I have to side with Mike. There really was only one black swan event.
Where's my yellow card? Yellow card.
He's right. There was only one, and that was the 7th of October, I think. All that before is a result of black swan events, if you want to, in 2022, and all that afterwards is the result of October 7th, including the Red Sea blockade. That's number one. Number two, what it shows us is that there is enough oil in the world. You know, this is where Mike and I have parted sides very often in the past. You know, but I do think what we are seeing is ample oil supplies. announced cuts of OPEC and OPEC Plus with big words and very little effect, because many of these oil supplies are coming from outside of OPEC. And in terms of your definition now, Sean, and if you talk about black swan events, what you want to call it, one of the reasons the oil price reacted very little is that when you have a sizable buffer of spare capacity, then geopolitical shocks or any kind of economic outside shocks are going to have, if they are positive, a much lower impact than if you have no spare capacity. And one of the things OPEC and OPEC Plus has given us over the year 2023 and 2022 is ample spare capacity. So in a way, it's starting to become very self-defeating. And when we talk about later about trends into 2024, I would go one step further and say that they are getting themselves on the brink of a decision where they would have to either, stop creating that spare capacity or doing it in a much more powerful way in order not to prevent price spikes, but to keep from prices in the 70s.
Mike, looking at that, sort of looking towards 24, and the reason I wanted to sort of get the context of the relative immunity of the oil markets from shocks, in the sense that a well-supplied, idle supply, these aren't black swans, but ultimately a market that is in a major war still going on in Europe, etc., that it sort of gives us a prism in which to look forward into 24. We started 23 with a market that was quite tight, very well, managed by OPEC Plus. And as the year went on, that sort of grip loosened. As we go into 24, through that prism, what do you see big events to watch out for, whether they be market trends, whether they be otherwise, that you think will determine the direction of travel for the markets and prices?
If you just go back to the fundamentals of supply and demand, and starting with crude oil, with a couple of short-term exceptions, there's more oil available from more sources than has been the case for a very long time. Venezuelan oil is back. The General License 44 is in place. Of course, Venezuela has seen chronic underinvestment, and therefore it's not producing at what it used to do in the Venezuelan glory days, but nonetheless, that oil is coming to market. There's still a question mark hanging over Kurdish evacuation, certainly to the Mediterranean, but some of that oil is finding its way to domestic refining and into southern exports. And with the exception of a short-term blip in Libya and the El Sharara field, which is significant, we have oil coming from everywhere, and sanctioned sources of crude, namely Iran and Russia, are finding their way to market in decent quantities also still. So the entire thesis of underinvestment coming out of COVID on long lead deep water projects by the oil majors, which caused a lot of concern that there would be a consequent lack of non-OPEC production. The numbers for 2023 are roughly 1 million barrels a day from the Americas alone, with the USA, Brazil, Canada, and Guyana in that order, each of them at least 250,000 barrels a day year-on-year supply growth, making up more than half of oil demand growth under anyone's demand growth measure. And the consulting shops and research companies still differ a little bit on the 2023 oil consumption. But looking forward to 2024, will that continue? There is still a consensus of analysts that the US has continued to grow crude supply from right now about 13.3 to this time next year, maybe 13.6 seems to be the midpoint consensus, maybe 13.5. So that's not the same pace of growth from the US. But it looks like the bringing on stream and the maintenance of production from the pre-salt Brazilian structures, the next phase from Guyana, will all add production, which challenges OPEC. And for OPEC to have some wriggle room to allow for the historic non-compliance, there's never 100% compliance, requires global demand growth to outpace that non-OPEC supply I talked about. And I was just talking about the Americas, of course. Now, on the demand side, you keep coming back to places like China and India. Those are the two major economies that are going to account for growth in 2024. And we see some slowing in China, although the official GDP growth number is still 4.5 and India 6 point something. So those two are going to be the stalwarts of demand, but very different. It's largely petrochemical feedstocks in demand for China, LPG and naphtha, which is the growth accounted for in 2024. And in India, it's all diesel. So the fundamentals for 24 look similar to 2023. And of course, the big focus is on the spare capacity that Christoph's been talking about, and how OPEC Plus and Russia keep their various partners or factions in line.
Christoph, picking up on that, I mean, fundamentals, the we ended the year in sense 23 with OPEC plus, having a difficult meeting, or a difficulty in arriving at a decision, a meeting that went on, that the fundamentals of the supply side are heavily weighted in a ability to cut and cut. So it's hard to call those oil market fundamentals. Your thoughts on outlook?
Well, I would say two things. One, reaching into the back and connecting it to the future. I think 2023 was sort of the annus horribilis for oil analysts, so energy analysts generally, but particularly oil analysts. A huge amount of humble pie actually should be eaten. I remember at the beginning of the year when everybody predicted, not everybody, but a lot of people, $180 or $200 oil. And then China coming out of COVID would be the big jump, overlooking the small fact that the Chinese consumers had not been stuffed with fiscal transfers during the lockdown, as was the case in Europe or the US. Then, the US, the rig count goes down, horrible, horrible, overlooking completely the improved productivity per rig, reading the whole shale story wrong, as a story where the money now goes to investors and the financial sectors, not as a story where productivity was streamlined and the Americans did in oil. And that's what they have done in so many other industries before. So I'm saying all of that not to put the blame on the people, although I thought it should be to some extent. It's amazing to me how people get away with impunity, but because it leads to a degree of caution about the forecast for 2024. Now everybody says, oh, too much oil and it's going to be pressure on the supply side. So one has to be very cautious on that. And what do we know about 2023? I agree again with Mike. We know that even more so, I would say that supplies are likely to exceed demand at the moment. So there would be downward pressure to start with. But then I would raise at least three other points which promise to throw maybe all of this aside again. One is what will happen most likely in the year 2024, even though it's not immediately connected to oil markets. There has to be an admission at COVID-29 or before of the International Panel for Climate Change that the Paris targets will be missed, full stop. And that will have repercussions on the whole discussion on energy transition, climate change, which will also affect the oil markets. It may be less of a topic, it may become more of a topic, it may be driven more by panic, maybe driven more by people reluctantly engaging with this topic at all. But it's something which will have, it's in the numbers, it's there, we see it. And which hasn't
there was a lot of talk about at COP28 just a few weeks ago here in Dubai about holding on to that 1.5 degree, more fantasy, more rhetoric than reality. And your point is well taken, that it's time to acknowledge realities and adjust scenarios accordingly.
The second, yes, I think it will have a spillover into oil market discussions. We don't know about nature. The second one is the whole debate on peak oil will gather speed, because again, it's in the numbers. I still believe that within that decade, we are likely to see peak oil demand, and that will change everything, just like the shale revolution has completely changed geopolitics and the global economy with this American energy independence. Peak oil demand will mean a shrinking market. In a shrinking market, as I've said many times, the low-cost producer is king. In order to maintain the same amount of exports you have today in a shrinking market, you will have to, by definition, increase market share. This means price competition all over the place. How OPEC, and especially OPEC Plus, will hold up under these conditions, or whether they at some point say, okay, then we have to let it go and bring prices really low to eliminate competition, is an open question. Whether it will come to a 4 in 2024, the year behind, we don't know. But it will come most likely in that decade, and it will change oil markets in a very, very substantial way, I think. And then the third event is, again, something, in this triangle between economics, geopolitics, and global energy, it's rare that energy is in the driving seat and impacts the other two. It's more often the case that energy and oil is impacted by economics or by politics and wars and so on. We have one of these events with that potential in 2024, and that's the American election. In both respects, if it may create a lot more instability, including global confrontations, or it may usher in a period sort of more reconciliation and more return to America in a normal way, stabilizing its leadership positions in the world. But it's going to be another watershed moment with very at the moment, unclear consequences for oil markets. And what we do know is that we have these events and need to try to figure out from the beginning which way they will impact the markets we are interested in. And that's a little bit the task at the moment. And it's really hard to have a crystal ball, even with these known events. And the famous black swan events we shouldn't discuss because by definition they are unknowable.
Well, Mike, just to pick up on that point with Christoph, the idea that we should acknowledge certain things. We should acknowledge that the Paris climate will not be met and adjust strategies accordingly. I put it to you that we start a year in which we should acknowledge that China has reached some element of as the Eurasia Group has called it, peak China, and that the China is now is not coming back like out of COVID. Oh, everybody's still waiting for Godot, and that peak China, the manufacturing industrial build China is now over, and we're in a different place, and adjust accordingly. Your thoughts of that theory, Eurasia Group? I'm echoing it a bit. Peak China, will that sort of penny will drop in 24?
I'm not so sure, Sean. There's been a lot of discussion about the third consecutive month of negative PMI numbers out of China, below the 50 mark. But you have to put that alongside the demand numbers for energy. Power demand is up, and even demand for commodities that's heavily influenced by the construction sector, which is the weakest part of the economy, namely cement, is up. So is shorter-term consumption of transportation fuels. So whilst you have an economy that everyone says is in the doldrums, the official growth numbers is still around the 4.5–5% number. But the short-term nowcasting, as some of us call it, is showing a pretty resilient set of demand numbers coming from something that is not construction and is maybe not even manufacturing, given the negative PMIs. But China is on the move. We just had the government forecast the likely travel for the Chinese New Year period, which of course falls in a slightly different period every year, but they're forecasting nearly 10% more flights and therefore jet demand than in the highest previous, which is the pre-COVID Chinese New Year in 2019. So, I mean, just as a microscopic snapshot, I was on holiday in the Alps, and the proprietors of hotels and shops and restaurants were telling me they've never seen this many mainland Chinese tourists. Of course, those are the upper classes that make it all the way to Switzerland. But if you have something like 35 million Chinese joining the spending, saving middle classes, even if only a fraction of them jump on planes for the first time in their life, I think we're going to see jet demand close that pre-COVID gap, which is the last piece of the demand barrel that's missing. And as for peak oil, yes, in the West, yes, in OECD, we're down still more than 1 million barrels a day on pre-COVID demand in OECD, but non-OECD, the rest of the world, is up 3.7 million barrels a day compared to pre-COVID. And the number that we're kicking around here, which is the consensus of all the analysts, is that 24 oil demand growth versus 23 is still going to look like something like 1.6, 1.7, 1.8 million barrels a day, including NGLs, of course. And that's still a very steep trajectory to get from.
How much of that would you? How much of that 24 number we saw obviously last year? China was a big part of the 23 demand growth number. I think of the 2.5, maybe it was more than half. What percentage would you see China demand growth in 24 of that 1.6?
Well, more than a third. More than a third easily. And I'd have India at
has to be a lot more. If it's off the growth, not off the total, then it has to be more.
Mm. I mean, the question obviously is that where does demand growth go from a China point of view? We started the day actually with S&P Global Commodity Insights forecasting 2030 as peak demand, following the IEA announcement a few months ago. S&P Global have come to the same sort of conclusion. Nonetheless, they still see a 9 million barrel a day growth in demand between now and then. Christoph, I wanted just to get your thoughts on the end of the year 23. We saw the OPEC Plus meeting. We had a session earlier today that said OPEC meetings were lasting minutes and then end of the year lasting weeks. How does OPEC Plus look like to you going into 24? Is it the force it was? They lost Angola a few weeks ago. Where's their role in the market, you think, in 24?
I think they're in a very difficult position. I think a lot will depend whether they can sort of continue to muddle through, which would have the precondition that oil demand comes in anywhere close to what you just quoted with 1.7, 1.8 million. That's far from certain. I think I have something here in the way.
Yeah, there's a survey question about whether the black swans the market will remain immune. I suppose the ultimate part of that question now, having discussed it, is what's your definition of a black swan? But
I think that the projected supply increases from outside OPEC plus are large enough to cause problems for Saudi Arabia and Russia to enforce cuts, which would be larger, which is necessary in order to really sort of affect the balance between demand and supply. I think that more people will wake up to something which must be already discussed in the leading circles of OPEC plus, which is what I mentioned earlier, the fact that demand is at some point going to peak, because right now we have this amazing phenomenon. All these guys are cutting and at the same time expanding production capacity, complaining there isn't enough demand, investment from one side, and then themselves increasing capacity hugely, including the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Russia, and cutting production in order to keep it up. That looks to me like a preparation already, for some battles for market share. I think at the end of the day, depending, as I said, on the supply numbers from elsewhere and on global demand, if they come this year or next year, there will come a tight spot where Saudi Arabia would have to think about the early 80s and to ask itself the question, do we open the taps and teach others a lesson? Or is there a way of teaching them before just by using the threat or using arguments to join the cuts? If the cuts are not joined more broadly and carried out by mostly Russia and Saudi Arabia as currently, then this will be a dead-end road.
Mike, your thoughts on the same thing? I mean, more about, what do you still look to OPEC plus to give a clear direction of travel for the oil markets in 24? Are they the force they were a year ago, the world's largest informal oil exporting group?
No, as I hinted before, I think 24 looks like it's going to replay a lot of 2023. The call on OPEC plus and on Saudi in particular, who have taken on the mantle of swing balancer, will remain well below their capacity. And in order for supply demand to remain in balance and the sort of slight backward curve to the crude markets, which favors OPEC's policies, they will continue to have to keep capacity off the market. And that capacity, as Christoph said, is growing as people continue to invest in having the upstream capacity. And I guess the biggest excess capacity versus quota is where you're sitting, Sean, in the Emirates. Yeah.
And when you look at the sort of aspiration OPEC cutting and you put it up against what you said, repeat mirror of 23, where we had the Americas growing, is that balanced going into 24 through 24? You signaled your thoughts that the Americas couldn't continue on the same trend line of growth, and so OPEC may not have to cut it. I mean, where do those two things meet in a 24 market with a 1.6 demand growth? Does OPEC plus need to cut more to balance the market? Mike, your thoughts on that?
Yes, if non-OPEC supply is going up and taking a fair percentage of the overall demand growth, and that leaves OPEC having to cope with the balance. I mean, I think it's fair to say the demand growth we've been talking about, 1.7, 1.8 million barrels a day year on year, is substantial. It's a healthy kick to the upside in terms of demand. Non-OPEC won't close all of that. Therefore, there's space for OPEC plus to take some extra share of production, but it's not material. It still requires them to keep their policies pretty much in line with what we've seen for the last couple of years.
Christoph, just looking at widening the lens, our last few minutes together through the 24 outlook, it is a year full of major elections. You mentioned one in your earlier comment, the US in November, but of course we've Taiwan this month, we've got Pakistan next month, we've got Indonesia coming up. Will this remain the same? The market immune? Yes, but the European elections mid-year, members of European Parliament, even the British are likely to. Where do you think these other wider events in parallel that that are very relevant to the wider energy markets? What do you see looking out that paying attention to?
I think we should not expect too much from Europe. It will continue to be an area, if you want to say slow growth, that would be true. If you wanted to say moderation in global politics, that would also be true. So however you phrase it, not very exciting, but probably rational and reasonable. It will not be able to completely shoulder the burden of supporting Ukraine against Russia, given the way in which Russia has transformed itself into a very effective war machine, including its
Do you think we're in the end game of Russia-Ukraine?
No, not yet. I don't think so. I think that Mr. Putin is playing a long game. He's played it very well. And I do know from the economic side that Russia really has effectively transformed itself into a military wartime economy. And the domestic resistance is allowed to leave the country, so it's not very effective. And Ukraine is hanging on by a thread, but is completely dependent on Western support. Europe will not be able to completely replace America in that Western support. And my fear is that it's for a long time now, it looks like, you know, the Ukrainians get sort of enough to survive, but not enough to win. And that's not a very productive situation. It will not stop by Russia suddenly stopping it. But so I think that what we have in Asia is, like you said earlier, it's true that China is in a poor state. I was there, and it's not all bad, because a lot of it is really driven by expectations. So a very gloomy outlook there, very gloomy feeling, a little bit like, you know, the famous prisoner when the door opens after X years and he refuses to leave his cell because he can't imagine what's outside. That was the reaction to COVID to me, a little, how I would paraphrase it. And the economy also, the expectations much worse than from the outside. You say 5% growth is not bad, but for them, the decline from 8 to 5, it's almost borderline stagnation. These are things which are changeable, these expectations. China has one big Achilles heel, which relates to the people Mike met in Switzerland skiing, which is capital flight, which hasn't happened yet on a grand scale. But the government, whatever it does to fight the economic downturn, will have to keep controls in place of people just leaving, like they left Russia, and taking their money out. And that is a threat which explains a lot of the kind of restrictions we are seeing in Chinese politics, which will not go away. So in Asia overall, you will have I think that China will not decline any much further, but it's not clear to me that the others are ready to take over India and Indonesia in terms of global economic growth, and that's what matters for oil demand. And in the US, it looks pretty good. You know, never bet against the US on both fronts, with the shale front and also with the soft landing of the economy. So that at the beginning of 24 would indicate that you have strong growth in North America, a little bit of that reflected in South America, where Brazil is doing reasonably well with a lot of instability behind us. Hopefully Argentina probably being able to recover. So that would, in the wake of the American ship, we lifted up. Europe would sort of muddle through also together with the Americans. China will have another year of adjustment, but probably bottoming out, in the rest of Asia not quite able to take over. That would indicate slightly slower global growth in 23 and in 24 than in 23, and therefore a little bit of a decline in oil markets. Now, with oil demand, just one last word, we have to be careful. It's not about before and after COVID. Oil demand in the OECD has peaked in 2006, not in 2020, and has been declining systematically ever since. In Europe, you know, they have now 1/3 more cars than they had then, but in 79 it has peaked. There's only India, China, and the Middle East itself which are growing in terms of demand, and that makes optimism on the demand side a dicey game.
Mike, last word to you in terms of that wider lens as we look out to 24 horizon.
Yeah, I mean, coming back to China, and COP24, they are still growing. They've overtaken Japan some time back as the world's biggest car exporter. BYD is outflanking Tesla as the biggest EV manufacturer. Their emissions credentials, there's a lot of policy, but they're behind on their rollout of their emissions scheme. In general, I think China is stealing market share on the petrochemicals front, which is the big new growth item. Huge capacity installed on the petrochemical side from neighboring countries. And as such, China is still growing in those base industries. On the supply side, I mean, those operators of those Brazilian and Guyanese assets, so Exxon, Shell, doing a great job at bringing supply to market. The Permian Basin sector is vibrant on the M&A front, so there's plenty of faith and backing there. some consolidation, but many asset transactions going through there, showing that there's interest not just from the private sector, but also from funds in backing low cost production in the right places. And I guess we haven't mentioned yet, but there are elections not just everywhere in the world, but also in the USA, which could, of course, lead to rather more interesting geopolitical policies should that go back to the prior president. But watch the news, I guess, because there's a big question mark over the outcome, isn't there?
Well, there certainly is, and along with many other question marks. But I take your note, and it's one worth paying attention to. China, don't give up on China. Clearly, it is the world's second largest economy, and in many ways, purchasing power parity, the biggest. So there's a lot. I suppose not growing at the bionic rates is different than contracting. So well noted on that. Christoph Ruhl, as always, thank you so much. From London, Mike Muller from Singapore. Great to have you both kick off the year at the Global Energy Outlook Forum. We look forward to more conversations through the year. All the best. Thank you.
Thanks, Sean. I'd admire your stamina doing this talkathon. Good luck with the remaining hours. Good luck.
Cheers. Thank you.
Half time, no?
Exactly.
Bye.